the sound that you hear like an echo in your head. There's a strange vibration rising out from the heart of America, America. Listen to the sound of the drum calling players to the game of the new world order. Don't be caught unaware when the heads start rolling. No, it couldn't happen here. I know it wouldn't happen here. But I will not submit to authority of man. I'm alive, I'm awake. This is more than I can take. If you had an open door, would you kill a little more? Listen to the cries of the dead in the wake of the Sudan. Is there no one out there? I see blood in the sands of despair in Africa. Listen to the sound of applause in a chamber full of men selling out their people as they plan their assault on the heart of America. No, it couldn't happen here. I know it never happened here. I will not submit to authority of man. I'm alive, I'm awake. This is more than I can take.
And hello, everybody. Welcome to another evening Double Cross Radio coming to you live on the UCY network. I'm Chuck Horton. I'm your host tonight. And I got to clear my throat. Just pause for a second here. Excuse me. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the rise of the Roman Republic. But before I get into that, just a little bit of current events just because I can't help myself. I thought last night's debate, and I didn't watch it or listen to it, I just read some of the transcript. The people at CNN that had to ask those questions, they must be embarrassed, ashamed of themselves. I can't believe that there are that many news people that are so hungry for money that they will reduce themselves to this level of prostitution, or prostitution, we'll call it. They are. Those questions were horrible. Like, it's like, well, Mr. X said this about you. What do you have to say about him? I mean, who cares? I mean, we kind of want to know what their policies are, or how they would fix things, or what things they have, or what policy decisions they have that separate them from everybody else and make them a better choice for people. Not just how would you respond to someone else calling you a curmudgeon or something. It was just, it was almost, I can't imagine the people that actually watched for 3 hours and didn't actually want to go out and slit their wrists at the end. I just reading the transcripts of it, I would just had to pause and go outside and get a fresh, breath of fresh air once in a while. I said, I can't believe this happened. And those candidates just stood there for the 3 hours and were subjected to this. It was like, being in junior high or something. It was horrible. But here, today when I was driving around, I had I'd already established what I was going to talk about tonight, but I thought, well, this would be fun to talk about. What were some of the questions that weren't asked last night? That probably people in the United States would, they'd want to know. A lot of the candidates there, I mean, they would, in fact, I think Otto mentioned this in his, kind of alluded to it in the chat earlier today during the previous show. He's talking about something that Ann Coulter said, and let's see if I can find. No, I can't go far enough. I'd go to the next page. Oh well, I'm not going to do that. Yeah, maybe he could. Oh, there's Ann Coulter. No. Well, it doesn't matter. But there's like these guys are going on and on and on, and they all seem to want to invoke the name of Ronald Reagan. They want to talk about how they're a friend of Israel. They want to talk about how they're they're going to prosecute this war. They're going to be successful. And it's like, how about some of the real problems here? We have an economy where there's over 50 million people out of work. How do those guys that want to reinforce things on the war front and really go after all these people, how can they reconcile that stance with our teetering economy that's on the brink of disaster? More government spending is going to make things worse, not better. I don't know. That was all but about one of the candidates was a warmonger, as far as I could tell. Donald Trump, I mean, here's a question you could ask Donald Trump. He had stated more than once that he would build a wall across the southern border and make Mexico pay for it. Just how in hell are you going to do that, Donald? I mean, did he also maybe author a book, How to Win Friends and Influence People? Because I don't think Mexico would pay one dime. What are you going to do, send an army after him? That's sure going to... do you realize there's about 20 or 30 million Mexicans living in the United States? I mean, it's like they've got an ingrown revolutionary army that could just terrorize the American population for decades. And this is just the stupidest idea I've ever heard in my whole life. Anybody consider voting for this guy for president? It's equally stupid. I mean, if you can't figure out that this is the worst idea, anything smells on ice, you probably shouldn't be voting. Jeb Bush says he's for Common Core, and I just want to know, did you stop reading the Constitution when you got to the Eighth Amendment? Because, I read the whole thing, and I can't find anything in the Constitution that gives the federal government authority to force school districts all across this country to adopt Common Core. This is something that is covered in the 10th Amendment. It says things that aren't specifically granted, powers that aren't specifically granted to the government are reserved for the states and the people. And I think this is pretty well spelled out. So I don't know why Mr. Bush, former Governor Bush, and people of Florida thought he was great. I don't know why. Maybe he's better as a governor than he would be as a president. But I don't know why they think that this guy is really something. He's just for expanding the power of federal government over our lives. And I would never vote for him. I would leave this country before I would serve. I would live in this country another year under a Bush president. Here's another question that nobody got asked that they probably should is, all of you people are for market economies, and you say that the market is the way to solve things. But if you're for market economies, so why should the banking industry enjoy a monopoly on the creation of money? And the Federal Reserve is as the head of that banking institution. They're a private corporation. Why should private corporations be able to legally counterfeit and nobody else can? And why do they not have any competition? If competition is such a great part of a free market, how come we have this banking monopoly in this country? Central bank. It's just horrible. No one asked a question about that. No one asked a question about 9/11. I mean, we just had the 14th anniversary of 9/11. We did a show on that on this very show, Double Cross Radio. But can anybody here explain, and I would be talking, this would be a question I'd be asking the candidates, can anybody here explain how 2 planes flew into buildings on 9/11 and 3 buildings fell down? That would be a question I would want to hear any of the candidates with any kind of a reasoned response to that. And while I'll agree that probably doesn't set them up as how qualified or not they are to be president, it would let you know how qualified or not they are to lie to people. And then another question I think should be asked to the candidates is, what specific government programs and cabinet position things like the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, what specific government departments and programs would you cut in order to begin to lower our national debt? That's a pretty simple thing. I mean, this is a real problem we have. We have an increasingly large number of people employed by the federal government, and these people produce nothing. They destroy the wealth being generated by the few people who actually work outside of government. Oh, I just need to know if any of these people are really serious about cutting government programs. This country existed up until 1980 without a Department of Education. And how were we doing? We had one of the most literate societies in the world. And in the 30 years since the creation of the Department of Education, we have plummeted to the bottom of the industrialized world. So it's clearly not working. Hello? So here, thank you, Otto, for posting this. Here's the quote from Coulter. "Good grief, Huckabee is running for Prime Minister of Israel," she tweeted. And then later she said, "Cruz, Huckabee, and Rubio all mentioned Israel in their response to what will America look like after you were president." And then she had a tweet saying, "How to get applause from GOP donors. 1, pledge to start a war. Talk about job creators." And that's all it is, talk. There's no job creators. "Denounce abortion, cite Reagan, and cite Israel." So there you go. Okay. That's enough for current events. I just in this current crop of, if people in the Republican Party think that there's anybody up there on the stage other than Rand Paul that even has a chance of beating whoever the Democrats run, you guys are delusional. Every year you fall for the same trick. It's like Lucy holding the football for Charlie in the fall. And she goes, come on, let's kick. And he says, "No, you're going to pull the ball." I said, "No, I'm not going to do it. And he runs up there and she pulls the ball out and he falls on his back. Don't you know this is the same thing they're doing right now? All these people, they're just looking for somebody who has some kind of a sex appeal or crowd appeal or is good at telling jokes or something that will get enough people behind him so that they can actually run them as a candidate. But they're just all there to give the illusion of choice. The person who's going to win, is supposed to win, is Hillary Clinton. And unless the Democrat Party actually grows a pair and tells her to get off her high horse and quit, or they're going to have the Attorney General issue a warrant for her arrest for all the federal laws she's violated in the last year. Until that happens, I just don't have any faith in the Democrats either. These are our two majority parties, and there's no choice between them. We have criminals and criminals. What a choice! Let's try some. And please don't tell me Bernie Sanders is a choice, because the man's a socialist. I mean, like, when in the history of the world has socialism ever produced anything but hopelessness and despair? It doesn't work. It has never worked anywhere. It's taken prosperous countries like Sweden and thrown them in the toilet and flushed it. It's just horrible what socialism does. Okay. Now, on to the subject for tonight's show. Okay. Since my early childhood, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire has been, from time to time, introduced into my life experience. And those of you who are my age, I'm 64 in about 3 weeks. Those of you who have lived during the time that I've lived probably have experienced a lot of these same things. As a youth, I attended church every morning with my parents and went to Sunday school, and my first introduction into the Roman empires were that the people who were the emperors of Rome, actually, this would be just in the first few years after we went from BC to AD, that those Roman emperors actually would feed Christians to lions. So that was one of the first. Oh, thank you. My wife just brought me some carrot juice in case I need to clear my throat again. So that I just thought, whoa, those guys must have been really horrible people. But I did not know how horrible they were. Anyway, a few years later, the movie Ben-Hur emerged on TV, and even though this was a movie and it's kind of a fictional story that has some historical context to it, that was probably my second exposure to the Roman Empire. Again, it wasn't such a pretty picture. There was a lot of, at the end, the Roman Empire was pretty decadent, and it was falling apart, and it kind of ate itself almost. As I progressed through grade school, part of the curriculum was kind of a world history type of thing. We went through Marco Polo, and we went through different events, and part of it was the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We didn't really spend a lot of time on it. We talked about things like Nero fiddling while Rome burned. I did not learn what that really was all about until much later in my life. Great. In junior high, there was some more added to my knowledge there, and they talked about mythology and how a lot of the Romans, they believed in the gods, the same gods that the Greeks had believed in, but they just gave them different names so they could pretend that they were their gods, and they were different than the Greek gods. They had, the Greeks had Zeus, and the Romans had Jupiter. They're basically supposed to be the same guy. And anyway, they also we had American history. We began to learn that in junior high, and part of talking about American history, we talked about the founding document, the Constitution. Actually, the founding document was probably the Declaration of Independence, followed by the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution. But in talking about all that, my teacher, my instructor, I don't know if you were as fortunate as I, if you're my age, but he commented on how important the Roman Republic was to the founders of the United States, the people who wrote the Constitution and so on, and how they had tried to implement some parts of the Roman Republic. I'm saying, wait a minute. Roman Republic, isn't the Roman Empire, wasn't that a horrible, and they go, no, the Republic was before the Empire, and no one had ever told me that. I had never known that before. So it wasn't until I was maybe 13, 14 years old before I even knew there was a Roman Republic. But I got no more information on that as I went through my indoctrination known as public schooling. And aside from an occasional movie, I had no more was added to my knowledge base for many years after that, even into college. In my 50s, I had what in hindsight was an enormous misevaluation of my talents as a writer. I am not a talented writer by any means, and I thought that I knew a lot about subjects that I know really just a little bit, superficial knowledge, although today in some of those areas I know a lot more. I still do not qualify as an expert by any means. I probably know a little bit more about economics than I do about history, but I thought it would be a really great idea to write a book that would explain historic events through an economic lens. In other words, you're trying to understand what was happening through economics. I still think it's a great idea. I hope, someone like Tom Woods, if he'd combined with one of his economic friends like Jeffrey Herbener or Robert Murphy, someone like that, this would be just a dynamite book where the economics of what was going on could be explained, and you could see how these economic policies had impacted society and led to either the rise or the fall of the Roman Empire, the Republic, and then later the Empire. Or you could see how the economic policies of the King of England had led to the American Revolution and the start of the United States of America. Or you could see how the economic policies of the Delano Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, while they weren't responsible for starting the Great Depression, they kept us in the Great Depression for 17 more years. Or, excuse me, be 13 more years. J. Edgar Hoover is the one responsible for starting the Great Depression. But you can still see how those economic policies were responsible for the events that happened. Once you understand economics well enough to see this, it's pretty clear. But you still have to be able to write. You still have to be able to make it a story. You have to make it something that people can read. It's interesting. I need a lot of work in those areas. So while this might have been, I doubt that this is a loss for humankind and the society in general. The only person that's profited so far from this is I've learned a lot in discovering that I'm not really a good writer. I'm just pretty average. But it's been an interesting. I still work on this area from time to time, and I think it's really very interesting. History has always been interesting to me, but now that I know economics better, it's even more interesting. It's more understandable. It's not, history shouldn't be about who fought in this battle and who was the general on this side and who was the general on that side, and it should be, why did they fight in the first place? And usually it's over something that's economic in nature. And if you come to start to understand that, you realize that this has been the cause for a lot of conflict in the world. And probably not every war. There's probably some religious wars. There's probably some that are just power-mad people that are trying to enhance their holdings by capturing somebody else's property. Well, and you might say, well, that has an economic theme to it. Yeah, but it isn't really causing them to become grand or whatever. Those types of people generally flame out pretty fast, and they never amount to much. It's only when you have an economic system that's better than everybody else's that you're able to rise above them, and then you become almost unbeatable for a period of time. And for a while, the Roman Empire was that, but it fell apart. And if it was really a sustainable development that they had, and it was for a long time, very sustainable, but they lost, they stopped going with what got them where they were. They stopped going with the good stuff, and they started adopting economic policies that led to their downfall. I wanted to know more about the Roman Empire, but after doing the work that I had done on it, I think that really the most interesting part of that area of the Roman society was really the Roman Republic, which preceded the Roman Empire. And there's lots of reasons that have been advanced why the empire fell apart. I think some of the economic ones that make the most sense to me had to do with they debased their currency, introduced fiat currency. They did a lot of things that devalued the wealth of the dollar, and that people stopped working because when you don't have any faith in your currency, when you don't know what something is worth, it's hard to have exchanges. It's hard to use currency as something that's going to facilitate trade and exchange when nobody knows what that worth of that currency is because of the debasement that's taken place by the government. Well, that was probably one of the major reasons, but very few historians ever advance that. They point to the decadence and that's all true, but when you can print money on paper and get people to use it as though it has some value when it really has questionable value at all, and you get to live off of their hard labor and you don't have to do anything, that kind of attracts decadent people into positions of power. So I don't think it was so much the case of the empire becoming decadent as the system of government evolved to a point where that they had absolute power, and that attracted the most decadent people around, and good people that spoke out had their heads chopped off, and so everybody kind of hunkered down and just tried to deal with it, and eventually they kind of destroyed themselves. But how they got to that point of wealth and riches is a really interesting story, and that's the story of the Roman Republic. And Rome wasn't always a republic. It wasn't always, didn't always occupy all the lands that it ended up occupying. It certainly occupied a big chunk of Italy by the end. But at the beginning, Rome was kind of like a city-state. It was in a beautiful location in Italy, in kind of the central part of Italy, where same place it is today, the Seven Hills and all that. It was also well suited for natural defenses, and that's really important. My wife is from Poland. I've mentioned that several times on the show, and I've tried to learn the history of Poland just so I could understand the culture there better. One of the things about Poland that's really interesting is that they have no natural borders. And there is a Baltic Sea to the north. There is a small mountain range in the south, but there's several really easily passable passes that are accessible almost year-round. In the east and west, there's no borders at all. And John Kay, who is the main man at Steppenwolf, he wrote a song once about growing up behind the Iron Curtain. And I haven't been able to confirm this, but I have a hunch that it was in Poland that he grew up. Because one of the lines in the song goes like this. It goes, "My birthplace would be hard to find. It's changed so many times, I'm not sure where I belong." Well, what he's talking about is the border. As they'd been invaded, the borders would shift back and forth. And so even though he's born in this one spot, it used to be this country, and then it was this country, and then it was this country, and it just didn't make any sense to him as a child, and it probably doesn't to a lot of us. But that's kind of how it is in that region. With no borders on the east or west, they were invaded from the east, they were invaded from the west, and they had to deal with that their whole existence. And it's amazing that the people of Poland, they were able to maintain their language, their customs, and their culture, despite being overrun by invading hordes time and time again. They did have a little bit of a natural border from the north and the south, but it wasn't enough to make up for the lack of border to the east or west. It just has rivers which are easy to cross. And Rome, unlike Poland, enjoyed the Alps to the north, but of course that rascal, it'll come to me in a minute. They got invaded from the north, and no one thought they could come through the Alps. The general, what's his name? It was anyway. He had elephants. He used elephants to cross the Alps and come down into Italy, and he actually defeated the Romans for a time, but he ran out. He was not able to resupply his armies, and they eventually were conquered. That's kind of the story of invading armies: is that you either have to keep moving and invading, or you have to resupply your army, which is very expensive. And unfortunately, our government could take a lesson from that page in history that they haven't. Well, anyway, the Romans did, despite the fact they didn't have a lot of invading armies from other areas, they did have natural enemies that were not that far away from the city of Rome. Hannibal. Thank you, Vincent. Yes, Hannibal. Who can forget Hannibal? Yeah. And anyway, the important part about conquering a nation and whatever is you have to hold the territory. And Hannibal wasn't able to do that. And I don't think we've been able to do that in Iraq or Afghanistan. We go in there, we mop up, we just annihilate the opposition. They all hunker down and go hide, and then we leave, and they come out, and it's like a vacuum that they fill, and they become the power source because all the other people have they've been knocked off. All the other authorities that are out there that could have kept them in check have been, the local people are gone, and so now you have these basically criminal outfits out there doing whatever they're going to do. And so when Rand Paul made that point in the debates last night that all of our actions, our preemptory actions that we've taken in the Middle East, have all led to worse situations than before they were enacted. And this is typical of what happens. So there's something right away we can learn from Roman history. Excuse me, I have to clear my... Okay, so anyway, fucking 18 packs go way too fast. Road dogging, especially on an empty stomach, and you haven't eaten, you're just not doing yourself any favors here. The Roman Republic, here's how the story goes. In the early days, before there was a republic, Rome was ruled by, I think it's called Etruscan kings, and they were kind of a group of, just kind of loosely allied group of people. That's a tribe that had grown and expanded and just anointed themselves kings, and they ruled over these areas, the cities, the Latinum cities, and for being the people that were rulers, they would, they would tax the people, and they would use those taxes to support themselves. And eventually, what happened is there was a son of one of the kings raped a nobleman's wife, and she later killed herself. Not a whole lot later, but just a few days later, killed herself because she felt shame, and she just couldn't get that memory out of her head, and so she kills herself. And her husband and the other nobleman take up her cause, and they hunt down the son who fled, because he knew they were after him, and he fled, but they caught up with him and killed him. And then they demanded that his father, the king, leave, and they kind of ran him out of town too. He tried to stay and fight, but he could see this was not going to be going well, so he took off, and he went to the city where a fellow city king, was there, and he enlisted his support to come and come in and try and take out these people that had taken over his little kingdom that he had there. And this was only, he was successful, and he talked this other guy into doing it, but they were unsuccessful in that the Romans had a little taste of some freedom. First of all, they're no longer being taxed, and so they were able to keep more of what they had, and they liked that a lot. And they were willing to pretty much fight to the death. And this other king and the king that had been deposed of, they were kind of counting on the slaves and the people that worked on the noblemen's properties to kind of rebel and join them to get rid of the noblemen. And it didn't happen. Those people, they were slaves, felt that the situation for them had improved once the kings had been disposed of. So they were not rallying to their support. In fact, a lot of them fought alongside their masters in trying to defend the city from these kings re-entering. And so once again, they kind of gave up, even though they may have, caused some casualties or whatever and didn't have many of their own. They thought this was just a battle not worth winning. Even if they'd taken possession of it, they never would have stopped the revolutionary acts that were there trying to be committed. So, so anyway, here they are. They have to figure out some way that they can administer to this area and do things. So they basically, a couple of different guys said, well, we'll take charge, and we won't be kings, but we'll be the leaders, and we'll take turns leading people. And one of us gets tired of it, someone else can take our place. And they started off doing this. And I want to tell you, if you've ever been in a situation where there's two bosses, and one of them says one thing and the other one says another thing, and and they can't possibly both be true. You can't follow both directions that they give you, because one of them is exactly 180 degrees opposite of the other. Those kind of things tend to happen, and when some poor, just peasant happens to violate Leader A's law that he had put on the books, because he was trying to follow the law that Leader B put on the books, he would get persecuted and punished. So eventually they lost the support of let's say, the common people, or the peasants and slaves. And they began to vacate the city and stop working for these people, and they would go out into the hills. They would live up in the hills and just kind of stay there, and they didn't want to be part of it. And eventually the noblemen and the estate holders saw that this was not a good trend, wasn't a good situation, and they reached out to these people and said, well, what do you want to come back? And the people up in the hills, they had a list of demands, and the one that seemed to strike a chord with all of them is that they were tired of the laws being arbitrarily ruled on, that the laws should apply to everybody equally, and they should always be enforced the same way, no matter who was at fault. And for some reason, that seemed to strike a chord with the noblemen too. And maybe because they had experienced the rape of the nobleman's wife, and had to take things into their own hands because the king was going to do nothing against his son. Maybe just they thought it was a good idea. And there were some other things that they wanted to have. They wanted to be able to veto any law that is passed if they didn't like it. And they didn't say that they could write laws or they could pass laws or enforce laws, that they wanted to be able to veto a law if they thought it was unfair or unjust or immoral. And there were some other things that they wanted. Some of them were accepted, some of them weren't. But eventually they came to an agreement, and they started what could be called the Roman Republic. And this was still just when it was just a city. It wasn't anything more than a city and the surrounding countryside, and it wasn't very big. And there were some other people out there that were kind of, call them like bandits, like countrymen. Well, in the Old West, this has been really overdone in movies. They were pretty rare because thieves don't make a very good living. Most of those guys that were bank robbers ended up dead at an early age. But there were some gangs that had some notoriety. Well, there were gangs of people like that in Rome as well. And these people saw that they noticed they were growing richer because they said they were no longer being taxed by a king. They gave them nothing in return. But they saw that they did need some common defense. And so they did decide that they would have some taxation, be very limited, but it'd provide for defense. And they began to create, use some of that money to create weaponry, to have the spears, swords, armor. They had time to, because they were wealthier, they didn't have to work as hard. They had time to develop military strategies, strategies that were superior to those being employed by others in that area. And so they had this ability they were able to beat up almost any attack and prevail. It's not to say that they won every battle. Sometimes eventually they were invaded from other countries. Ships would land full of soldiers from, let's just say, from wherever, somewhere in the Mediterranean, and they would start to attack, and sometimes they were overwhelmed. But this always had that problem. How do you keep resupplying this army? And they would eventually be whittled down in strength until they were forced to leave. So the Rome started to grow, and sometimes when they were attacked from other areas, they would counterattack and they would prevail, and they would take over that territory. And one of the things that they did that enabled them to grow was when they would take over a territory, they would allow the people there to have the same rights and privileges that Roman citizens had if they could qualify as a citizen. And that was pretty simple. You just had to be able to produce some kind of wealth, or basically it's a little more complicated than that. But if if you weren't a slave, there was a way you could become a citizen, and there were like 3 or 4 different levels of citizenship you could have. They may not ever be able to hold an office, but they might be able to own a business. They might be able to vote. They might be able to own land. It just kind of depended on which level they were. Anyway, I think you can see a lot of these ideas that were brand new ideas to Rome were implemented by our founding fathers. I mean, the thing about citizenship, being qualified to vote, being qualified to hold office, those were things they were kind of copying from the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, excuse me. Well, they really grew very fast, and they united a lot of the countryside. And I'm kind of taking shortcuts through all history. They had some ups and downs. It wasn't a straight up rise. They weren't, like I said, they didn't go undefeated, and they had other players in the Mediterranean region that were strong economically that they had to contend with. The people in Carthage, that's in today's area, would be Tunisia. Those were Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were they were master traders. They knew the waters of the Mediterranean very well. They knew how to navigate really well. They moved products here and there extremely well. Well, the Romans were starting to be able to ship and trade with people too, and they were starting to become competition for the Carthaginians, or people of Carthage, put it that way. I won't attempt to say it. Anyway, their answer to that problem was to try and attack them. There were about 100 years of warfare between the two areas, with 3 major conflicts during that time. Probably a lot of skirmishes and some kind of attempts to peacefully negotiate a peace in between. Eventually, Rome vanquished Carthage. They came into the city and leveled it. They went to the surrounding countryside and salted the land so it couldn't grow any food. Basically, just got rid of them as a threat. And then there was that didn't actually end the threat, because some of the people went across the Mediterranean into Spain and still tried to kind of peck away at the Roman stuff through reestablishing themselves in Spain. But all of that is beside the point. The point was, by offering people more freedom, by making them, limiting what they had to pay in taxes, people wanted to be part of Rome, because the Romans lived better than everybody else. When they would go in another city, or some other people would attack them, and they would attack back, or even if they had started the attack, they didn't mind so much becoming part of Rome, because there were all these advantages that came with it. Being conquered by the Romans wasn't quite as bad as, let's say, being conquered by the people from Carthage, because all of a sudden you had the possibility of being a citizen. You could get all the benefits that came with Rome, and their government continued to evolve and expand. Also, they started to define the rules. The people who were elected, they actually did have elections, and you could, if you were a certain level of citizenship, you could vote. And they started to define anyway. That's what caused Rome, the Roman Republic, to grow to a point where they actually started to have so much power that they began to attract people who I would say are nefarious in nature, the people that criminal types, people that you just don't really respect, people who are kind of half crazy to start with. And it was at this time that eventually, or shortly after this time, that one of these people said, there is no more of the republic. I'm now the Caesar, the ruler, the head guy, and this is now an empire. And because they had established this huge wealth-generating machine, it took several generations for this to start to fall apart, because a lot of people followed that. They said, yeah, sure, that's great. We'll unite more people. The more we conquer, the more we will be wealthy. But it wasn't like that. The more they conquered, the more wealth was sucked out of their country, until eventually the barbarians were able to walk in and sack Rome. And Rome was sacked by the Vandals, the Normans, not Normans, a lot of the tribes of France and Germany. And they're just listed in the history as barbarians, but sometimes you can get, if you read a little deeper, you read a better history book, you'll see where they came from. And the fall of Rome was from when it stopped becoming a republic and started to become an empire. When they started to actively try and acquire more property and loot it for what it was, there was no longer an advantage to being part of Rome. There was no longer a benefit to the people, and they started to resent the Romans. And despite all the things that they brought, the civilization, the roads, the aqueducts, the establishing forms of government that were actually pretty efficient. Despite all that, the price that people were losing was their freedom, and they were being forced to do things against their will, and they didn't like it. They resented it, and so the Roman Empire started to fall apart, and eventually it did. It lasted a little bit longer in Eastern Europe than it did in Western Europe. And that's just how it goes. But that is as much as I can condense into an hour, kind of the general story. Now, I wanted to also talk a little bit about, I alluded to this earlier, maybe it was the way they debased and destroyed their currency was responsible for their decline and the decadence. And this was from a talk given by a man named Joseph Peden, and he's a college professor, and it was a 50-minute lecture, and it was entitled Inflation and the Fall of the Roman Empire. It was given at a seminar on money and government in Houston, Texas on October 27, 1984. There's a link you can search for this at Mises Daily, and there's a free MP3 download of this speech. And anybody who's interested in this, I think you'd find this really not only informative, but also probably very, very interesting. Okay, now I'm just going to read some parts of this. He's just barely started into his speech. He goes, We may begin by looking at the mentality of the rulers of the Roman Empire beginning at the end of the 2nd century A.D. and looking through the end of the 3rd century A.D. Roman historians refer to this period as the crisis of the 3rd century, and the reason is that the problems of Rome's society in that period were so profound, so enormous, that Roman society emerged from the 3rd century very different in almost all ways from what it had been in the 1st and 2nd centuries. To look at the mentality of the Roman emperors, we can just look at the advice that the Emperor Septimius Severus gave to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta. This is supposed to be his final words to his heirs. He said, "Live in harmony, enrich the troops, ignore everyone else." Now, there is a monetary policy to be marveled at. Enrich the troops, ignore everybody else. Caracalla did not adhere to the first part of that advice. In fact, one of his first acts was to murder his brother. But as for enriching the troops, he took that so seriously to heart that his mother remonstrated with him and urged him to be more moderate and restrain his increasing military expenditures and burdensome new taxes. Ooh, he responded by saying there was no longer any revenue, just or unjust, to be found, but not to worry, for as long as we have this, he pointed to his sword, we shall not run short of money. Well, boy, some things just haven't changed, have they? But anyway, he was eventually assassinated. The real crisis came after he was assassinated, between 258 and 275, in a period of intense civil war and foreign invasions. The emperors simply abandoned, for all practical purposes, a silver coinage, and by 268 there was only 0.5% silver in the denarius. Now, 0.5%, that means there's 5 parts in 1,000. That's almost no silver at all. So, prices in this period rose in most parts of the empire by more than 1,000%. And here's something that happens when you have this kind of inflation. We use, whether we like it, let's see, when we lose money as a measure of value, we have trouble valuing all things, not just things you purchase, but all things. Now, how do we measure the value that somebody has to us as a person? There's a lot of subjective things that we use, objective things like how much it costs to help us to put a subjective value on something, and it's not necessarily it's not something that is I don't know the right word here. The lack of being able to value something isn't because we don't value it. It's we don't know how much to value. We don't know what is better than something else because we kind of lose that ability to form that equation in our mind, because those kinds of equations we use currency to help settle them. And who can put a price on friendship? Yeah, I know, but if you don't know how to put a price on anything because you don't know what anything costs, then suddenly the friendship and everything else, your love and all the things that are more subjective and emotional or different from person to person, those things become much, much more difficult to evaluate as well. And so there's this debasement of the currency leads to kind of a crashing of your culture. The things, anything can have value because nothing has value. And so instead of having great moments in art and literature and music, you have crap like we have in our pop culture today. And that's just, there are no longer very many Beethovens and Mozarts and Bachs that are out there. There just aren't, because in those days, in the days that they were there was some value that people could, I could express when they hear something. I would like to go, and I would like to be a mentor to this, or not a mentor, a patron to this artist because of the brilliance of his work, and I want him to continue, and because you could value it and you could help to support that. That's great, but when your money is worthless, when it doesn't buy anything, how can you give support like that? You can't, and you begin to devalue, to support anything. Crap costs the same as brilliance. Well, it's because nothing has any monetary value because the money has no value. They continue to, you think that 5 parts in 1,000 they've really debased silver, but they got worse. They recalled all those and they replaced them with bronze coins that had no silver at all. And it got worse and worse and worse. Inflation did not end for the masses of people. I got ahead of myself a little bit here. They also started to introduce gold as something as I think you had to pay your taxes in gold. So the government got the gold, but the government would only issue paper money. So all the gold flowed into the government, and they would use the real money to do whatever they wanted. And the people got the paper money that you wasn't even fit to wipe your ass with. And that's kind of how it worked. And even though gold was a hedge against inflation, it was only for those people who had it. The common people got the crap fiat currency that just wasn't worth anything. So what really brought them down wasn't it wasn't just the decadence. The decadence was brought about because there's no longer any values, because the monetary currency that they were using had lost all its value. And that's something that's been apparent any time we've had a hyperinflation issue. People remark about how their society starts to fall apart in other ways. It happened in Germany when they had their hyperinflation. The people that were the higher ups in society, all of a sudden they noticed that the next generation just seemed to have no value for anything. They didn't respect or admire or have any way to evaluate or even respect things that were being created. And so the German society began to just fall apart. They had had lots and lots of problems. We could see that same thing happen in Zimbabwe. The same thing has happened every time we've had a hyperinflation issue. It seems like the same pattern. And it's you can even read back here in the Roman Empire, people talking about how the money has destroyed their family, the debasement of money. And there's quotes from different people that you could look up. If you doubt me, I don't have time to go into all this today. I didn't have time to go and look those quotes up. I actually started to, and it might be a little bit of a struggle. I type the right words in the search engines. But I think I know they're out there because I've heard them read to me by a public speaker. So anyway, we're coming to the close of the show tonight. And I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Jules. You know, you guys don't understand out there listening. Now, sometimes the shows don't always come off without a hitch and all that stuff. And please don't ever blame Jules. She's not getting much out of this. She puts her heart and soul into this, and I just think she's awesome. And when I first started this show with Drew and David, I'd listen to those old shows, and man, listening to me on the radio was kind of painful. I said, wow, am I that bad? And that's still nothing to shout home, or to send a letter home and say, hey, listen to this, Mom. No, I'm still not that good. So anyway, the whole point is the people that are involved with UCY, they do it as a labor of love. They're doing it to try and bring stuff to people's awareness that they can't find anywhere else. They're trying to use their passion and interest to further all of your lives and make them better. And I just say that without Jules, none of this would be possible. So thank you, Jules. You're awesome. Always have to spend at least a minute of the show kissing up to Jules, but she's worth it. She really. I'm not just doing that because I'm trying to get brownie points. I'd get nothing out of this either. I just love her to death because she's given me this opportunity to talk to all of you 1 hour every week. And I apologize for not. Let's see. That was 2 weeks ago, so I'm not going to apologize for that one. But once in a while, there's a technical defect that isn't her fault. And the last time I wasn't on was because I didn't do enough due diligence in finding a place to stay where I was going that had internet that could support this broadcast. So that was that. So the music's going to start, and I'm out of here. And thank you all for listening tonight. We will see you all another time, another place. And next Thursday at 7 to 8 o'clock Pacific time, Double Cross Radio. Thank you. Good night.